of independence were mercilessly suppressed. The 5-century colonial period and wars of independence in the region killed more than 2 million Africans. Then, the era of the struggle for African independence began. African nationals who had traveled abroad and fought during World War II were exposed to the reality of nationalism, sovereignty, and independence. They began to agitate for a free state. After several years of fighting, President Charles de Gaulle reluctantly decided to hand independence, based on the French terms to former colonies in 1958. But as history tells us, it wasn't a complete independence. It came with conditions that gave France influence over the affairs of their former colonies. However, some African countries resisted this false independence. Notable among them was Sekou Touré of Guinea. Sekou Touré of Guinea saw the so-called independence for what it was and decided to pursue his own country's independence. However, this decision turned out to be a tragic one, because when the French colonial elites discovered this, they became so furious, and in a historic act of fury, they destroyed everything in the country that represented what they called the benefits from French colonization. They took all their possessions as they left and destroyed all they could not take, including schools, nurseries, buildings of the public administration, cars, books, medicines, instruments of the Research Institute. Tractors were crushed and sabotaged, horses, cows on farms were killed, and stored foods were burned or poisoned. As scandalous and outrageous as this act was, it was obviously to send a message to all the other 14 colonies that the consequence for rejecting France's terms would be very high. This was how fear slowly spread through all the other African elites, and no other country found the courage to follow the example of Sekou Touré, whose slogan was, "We prefer freedom in poverty to opulence in slavery." Thinking of finding a solution to the problem, Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of the Republic of Togo, a small country in West Africa, found a middle ground solution with the French. Sylvanus didn't want his country to continue to be a French dominion, so he refused to sign the Colonization Continuation Pact de Gaulle proposed. However, he agreed to pay an annual debt to France for the so-called benefits Togo got from French colonization. This is insane. What kind of benefit did Togo or any other African country gain from colonization? According to France, it was they who built roads, railways, and other transport infrastructures. They built schools and churches and introduced the concept of education to Africans. They said they brought civilization, and without them, Africa would have remained uncivilized. While it is true they built transport infrastructures and the rest, to call that the benefit of colonization is an insult to the millions of people that endured and died in slavery. It would be an insult to several African cultures and identities that were eradicated as a result of colonization. The most annoying thing is that these infrastructures were not even built for the sake of Africans. These infrastructures simply helped to facilitate the colonization process. The transport network, for instance, helped to transport Africans and African resources from the colonies to Europe where they were exploited. It is quite pathetic that the Togolese leader agreed to pay for these so-called benefits, but the reality is that this was the only condition for the French not to destroy the country before leaving. However, the amount estimated by France was so big that the reimbursement of the so-called colonial debt was close to 40% of the country's budget in 1963. Consequently, the financial situation of just independent Togo was very unstable, and in order to get out of this situation, Olympio decided to leave the monetary system set up by colonial France, the FCFA, and create a new currency for his country. Sadly, on January 13, 1963, just 3 days after he started printing his country's own currency, a squad of illiterate soldiers backed by France killed the first elected president of newly independent Africa. Olympic was reportedly killed by an ex-French Foreign Legionnaire army sergeant called Etienne Gnassingbé, who supposedly received a bounty of $612 from the local French embassy for the hitman job. This was how Olympio's dream for a truly independent nation died with him. But Olympic Sylvanus was not the only leader who was killed by the French because they sought independence from France. On June 30th, 1962, Modibo Keïta, the first president of the Republic of Mali, decided to withdraw from the French colonial currency CFA, which was imposed on 12 newly independent African countries. For the Malian president, who was leaning more to a socialist economy, it was clear that the Colonization Continuation Pact with France was a trap and a burden for the country's development. But again, like Olympio, Keita became a victim of a coup carried out by another ex-French foreign legionnaire, Lieutenant Moussa Traoré, on November 19, 1968. In fact, during that turbulent period of Africans fighting to liberate themselves from European colonization, France repeatedly used many ex-foreign legionnaires to carry out coups against elected presidents. These include David Dacko, the first president of the Central African Republic, Maurice Yameogo, the first president of the Republic of Upper Volta, now called Burkina Faso, and President Hubert Maga, the first president of the Republic of Benin. In sum, during the last 50 years, a total of 67 coups happened in 26 countries in Africa. 16 of those countries are French ex-colonies, which means 61% of the coups happened in Francophone Africa. This demonstrates how France is quite desperate and active to keep a strong hold on its former colonies, whatever the cost. Now let's talk about the Colonial Pact. The Colonial Pact signed between France and the African colonies maintained French control over the African states' economies. It took possession of their foreign currency reserves. It controlled the country's strategic raw materials. It stationed troops in the country with free passage. It demanded that all military equipment be acquired from France. It took over the training of the African police and army. It required that French businesses be allowed to maintain monopoly enterprises in key areas such as water, electricity, ports, transport, and energy. France not only imposed import restrictions on a variety of commodities from outside the Franc zone, but it also imposed minimum volumes of French imports. These treaties, as inhumane as they are still in force and operational. For the past half-century, the clandestine and powerful African Cell has handled France's strategic interests in Africa, reporting only to one person, the French president. Some of the obvious repercussions of a dependency policy for African countries include reliance on the French economy, reliance on the French military, and an open-door policy for French private enterprise. So in fact, what Italian Prime Minister Luigi stated is correct. France is the West gendarme in Africa. Its dominion is exercised through a murky network of informal empires, with dominance in trade, banking, military, and political control. Till today, all the Francophone countries remain slaves of the French. They continue to pay an unfair colonial tax as compensation for non-existent benefits of French colonialism, which makes no sense because they are the ones who came to colonize Africa and are therefore supposed to compensate Africa for centuries of enslavement, colonization, rapine, and outright grand larceny. Aside from the colonial debt, all Francophone countries have their national reserves kept by France in the Central Bank of France. According to estimates, France has almost $500 billion in African countries' money in its treasury each year and will go to any length to maintain it. Furthermore, African countries do not have access to this money. In fact, France forced its former colonies, CFA countries, to deposit 65% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury, plus another 20% for financial liabilities, leaving them with only 15% of their own money. And if they require additional funds, they must borrow from France at market rates. Thus, these African republics are French taxpayers, but their populations are not French and do not have access to the public goods and services that their money helps to fund. It's no surprise that France is so developed because they fund themselves with money from Africa. One major question is, do French people realize they have been living off the wealth of African countries for over a half-century? And if they do know, do they care at all? Aside from that, France has the first right to purchase any natural resources discovered on the territory of its former colonies. African countries are also not free to seek other partners because French interests and enterprises are given preference in public procurement. They have the final say when it comes to natural resources. France also has the sole right to offer military equipment and training to African militaries, as well as to deploy soldiers and intervene in African countries to safeguard France's interests. This means they may violently topple any regime that does not dance to their tune and must only ally with France in times of war or disaster. In addition, France's former colonies are required to use the colonial currency, the CFA franc, and to submit an annual balance report to France. The Bank of France issues CFA currency and sets the general framework for economic and monetary policy. As a result, countries that use the CFA franc, known collectively as the CFA franc zone, have little to no control over domestic inflation rates. As a result, France reserves the right to depreciate the CFA franc anytime it sees fit, as it did in 1994 when the CFA franc was devalued from 50 CFA francs to 100 CFA francs. By controlling this currency, France keeps its ex-colonies mostly in Western and Sahel Africa in constant debt, enticing them to borrow more and more. So how do you expect African countries to truly develop when they're busy using all the money they generate for the past 50 years to pay a so-called colonial debt? This system used by France